In James chapter 1, we're going to be looking at this difference between the rich and the poor. And I want to read verses 9, 10, and 11. Believers in humble circumstances ought to take pride in their high position, but the rich should take pride in their humiliation, since they will pass away like a wildflower. For the sun rises with scorching heat and withers the plant. Its blossom falls and its beauty is destroyed. In the same way, the rich will fade away even while they go about their business. Um, as James starts off this section with the word believers, it's really the word brother. And so, as James, in many of his directives, all through the letter of James, he is highlighting Christians' relationship with each other. Now, we're going to get to James 1, 27, kind of that famous verse. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress and keep oneself from being polluted by the world. James could have kept on going with that definition of what religion is that God's looking for. And it also has to do with the relationship that we intentionally pursue with brothers and sisters in Christ. And that has to be right, because there is so much here in the book of James just about our relationship with each other as brothers and sisters. Notice they ought to take pride. And actually, it's a command form: take pride. It's the kind of boasting and I don't, here's what I did to think about this. In reading through the book of James, we have to ask the question, how was this relationship between the rich and the poor impacting the church? What do you think was going on that made it necessary for him to address this? If you've read through the book of James, there's two significant occasions that I believe are behind this. Can you remember, if you've read through James, what those two circumstances would be?
James 2, 1 through 7.
Okay. Describe.
Do not hold your faith in our glorious Lord with partiality. Or if someone enters into your assembly in fine clothes with a gold ring, and a poor person in filthy clothing also enters, and you look favorably on the one wearing the fine clothing and say, be seated here in a good place. And to the poor person, you stand or be seated there by the footstool. Have you not made distinctions among yourselves?
Okay. So James 2, 1 through 7, there was an immediate impact of the relationship between the rich and the poor in the assembly itself. So what was going on? Well, the person that came into the assembly that looked like they just walked off the street and needed a shower, trying
in the back of a church building.
yeah, looked a little rough around the edges. Those that were rich and sort of in control, what does it look like they were practicing?
Partiality.
It's true today, I think.
Yeah. You can sit toward the back. Walk in, shabbily dressed, go to the back. Now, James is, when we get to chapter 2, he doesn't just say, that really shouldn't be going on, and then he moves on. No, he said it's the sin of partiality. Now, here's what I want to ask you as a Christian today, reflecting on that going on back then. What makes that such a horrible thing in the eyes of God? And why is it a sin?
It would be mistreating a person, I think.
You're mistreating a person.
But you're only looking at the here and now.
Okay, you're only looking at the here and the now.
How God's
Okay.
going to lift up the
Somewhere there's a scripture, God does not respect the person.
That said again, Barbara, God.
No respect of.
Yeah, well, exactly. If God's no respecter of persons, then it's common sense to think he wants his people to be no respecter of
No,
persons.
no nationality also.
Well, that's it. I mean, this goes back to what Nancy said. Think of the countercultural value that James is raising up. Now, this is such a neat thing to talk about. When people become Christians, they're a new Christian, and they walk into the assembly, they don't automatically overnight get rid of all of their wrong values they've lived with. It takes a while. And so the church is always going to have the challenge of it, just even new Christians, helping them get rid of their old value system that doesn't honor God and replace it with the Christian value system. Think of how, and this has been in every culture throughout all of history, and you can just think about our culture. Think of how our culture functions with the rich being in power and taking advantage of the poor. Because if you think about it, only the rich, typically through history, have been the ones in position and power to be the shakers and the movers. And as a result, the person that's further down on the economic list in culture, they're usually only at the mercy of what goes on. And
We want to be careful that we don't make a difference, and cater to the poor and neglect the rich either. I mean, we need to treat everybody on the same level, rich or poor.
yeah, that most of the time not the problem. Most of the time it's flipped around.
Yeah, well, I know.
Yeah, yeah.
Something though,
Well, it could be. And for the church, well, even from its early inception, it seems that part of the gospel message was anytime there's a person that is poor and in need, that's part of the mission of the church. You respond to that because they're a person worthy of respect just as you are. And that's why when we get in chapter 2, this whole thing of showing favoritism, it's an outright sin. And when you read that, it kind of smacks you in the face because especially if you start doing some inner reflection, have I been guilty of favoritism in the past? You know, and so we have to really look at our own attitudes and practices. You know, is that something I struggle with? Well, here in chapter 1, he's starting off just showing the foundational difference between the rich and the poor. The poor seem to be in a position of humiliation, don't they? Shame and humiliation. Many times the poor don't like the position they're in to start with. It doesn't help if somebody takes advantage of them or disparages them. But what's going to be interesting is because James is going to propose this countercultural value, look at what he does. It is the poor that can be proud of their being lifted up, and it is the rich that are going to be humiliated. So things from the kingdom perspective are turned around. Now, chapter 2 with the assembly setting is the first problem that's going on. What does it look like as the second big problem in James between the rich and the poor?
Would it be chapter 5?
Yeah, what did you find?
It says rebuke for wealthy oppressors.
And what verse are you looking at?
Verse 6.
Yes. Warning to the rich who are oppressing the weak, the poor. How are they doing that? What's going on? So you look at verse 4. It's very specific. It even says, look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. And you have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. So here's what's happened. These guys that are owners of these fields, they have been stealing the wages of some of their workers. That's how they've gotten rich.
But
Defrauding.
does James necessarily mean rich brothers and poor brothers?
Well, I think he does.
Could he refer in the broader sense as
Well,
well?
that's a question.
In the community.
That's a question that's come up quite a bit in the letters, whether it's James or others. To me, it's simple. The direct application is to the congregation, to the churches. Now, there are principles that he's going to highlight that he hopes will also go beyond the church out into culture. But think about this. He says, now listen, you rich people. The people out in the culture that aren't Christian, they're not going to listen to this. This is to rich Christians. And what's made it so bad is, here's what's interesting. Look at what he does with the imagery. This is verse 5. You've lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. He pictures them as some sort of cattle or animal that the farmer would grow. And so the judgment day, this is wild. He'd given an image that because you've been so self-indulgent and you have defrauded the wages of your workers and you've been living in luxury, honestly, he's saying, from a perspective of destiny, you are fattening yourself up like cattle for the day of slaughter, and that's what judgment day is going to be for you. I'm like, wow, what an image. I mean, he just boom, right? I mean, he doesn't pull any punches here. And so I think what we have in the book of James is at least these two issues that has made this really important as he starts off in chapter 1. You've got partiality being expressed in the assembly, and then you've got rich Christians in that congregation that are getting rich. They're living luxuriously. They're living a self-indulgent life. That's bad enough, but apparently they've been defrauding their workers by keeping some of their paycheck for themselves. So think about that. And so many times preaching and the gospel message for Christian ethic meddles in people's lives. Have you ever heard the old saying where someone says, well, you've gone from preaching to meddling? Sometimes good preaching and teaching meddles on purpose. Some of this stuff shouldn't be going on. And he's real clear about it. So that keeping people's wages, and we'll develop this more when we get there, but keeping people's wages in your own pocket and defrauding them and then living a self-indulgent life, that's a sin. It's interesting. That's a sin. That is not the way God's people are supposed to be living. So both of these situations receive some of the strongest critique in the whole letter of James about Christian living that's gone awry. Christian ethics that's gone out the window. So, keep those two things in mind. Now, as we keep looking at these verses, notice again, he's going to talk about the difference between humiliation and exaltation. And you know what came to my mind as I'm also reading this? When I think of the words humiliation and exaltation, I think of Jesus. Remember where Peter says, Jesus, he talked about his destiny and what was set before him. In his humiliation, his judgment was taken away. But because he remained faithful to God, he was exalted back to the right hand of God. And so what I think I hear James using here in the background for this subject is, look at Jesus. He wasn't rich. In many ways, he ended up in the worst humiliation that a human being could have. And yet, he was exalted to high position by the right hand of God. That's why you will find Old Testament, some in the New Testament, where it sounds like Scripture says over and over, the poor are more receptive to the gospel than the rich. Now, if we say that, why would that be true? That the poor are more receptive to the gospel than the rich?
The poor have an awareness of their great need. But the rich are self-satisfied
Mhm.
and they think everything's just hunky-dory. They don't need anybody or anything. But
Did I tell you when I was 19 how I learned that? This is very practical. I spent a whole summer selling books and Bibles from door to door. Boy, that was an experience. Down in Corinth, Mississippi. Here's what I discovered. The wealthiest parts of town, nobody wanted a Bible. The poorest parts of town, you cannot imagine how many people bought a Bible. And just from that perspective, I as a 19-year-old, I'm going, what's going on here? So you begin to see even on that level, many people feel like they don't need God. I don't need religion. I've got everything I need. Life is happy. It's hunky-dory. Leave me alone. No. Well, there's more to life than just your possessions.
They need a Bible to read about the rich man that was gonna build more barns to start.
And many of them probably don't know that story. Or if they do, they're ignoring that story. Yeah. So this idea, I think, has behind it the wonderful example of Jesus in his humiliation, where he is ultimately exalted. Oh, man, only a couple more minutes. And notice what will happen to the rich with this illustration of the flower. This is interesting too, because we've already seen in chapter 5, it's going to be like butchered cattle for the day of slaughter. Well, here he uses a different illustration. He uses the illustration of a flower where the blossom falls and its beauty is destroyed. And literally, it's kind of interesting where it says the flower has fallen and the beauty of the appearance has perished. So think about how a pretty flower in the heat withers up and, it's not pretty anymore. And he says, likewise, in the same way, that's going to happen to the rich. So tell me the parallel or the correlation he's made here between the beauty of this flower wilting up in the scorching heat and then the blossom falling off and the beauty of it's gone. So what is he trying to say then is the future of the rich?
you can't take it with you.
I can't take it with you.
Cannot take it with you.
That would be one, okay. So isn't it interesting? See, I'm always amazed at how the New Testament writers and Jesus in his teaching, they will use little ordinary daily things that we're all familiar with to always teach a deeper spiritual truth that often people just kind of ignore. Well, what he's trying to tell here in this little section in chapter 1 is look at the destiny of the people that think there really are something and they're exalted in that position and they're rich. He's going, you gotta be kidding. It's just going to be like a flower in the scorching heat, and they're going to end up with that blossom falling off and the whole appearance of its beauty is going to be gone.
That happens, you remember?
Yeah, here today and gone tomorrow.
And as a gardener, I see that every single season.
Oh, yeah, okay,
I
yeah.
spend hours working the soil, going out buying these beautiful ants.
Uh-huh.
And my yard is like heaven on earth all summer. But fall comes in and winter and all those flowers. And right now I'm clearing the beds again. It's just a dead, rotten, gray piece of crusty stuff.
Mhm.
And it just crumbles in your hand. It's nothing.
Well, and
Like,
also,
it used to be so gorgeous.
yeah, well, and also stick with your illustration. Think what happens in the summer when it gets dry and hot. What happens to some of your flowers if they don't get water?
Oh, they still live. They do fine. They wilt. But it's the changing of the season.
Well, here, the point he's making, though, is not the changing of the seasons. He's talking about the scorching of the heat. Okay.
There are some flowers that do die.
Well, and that's his point. And what they're supposed to get from this is that the scorching heat really is the judgment upon the flower. Okay.
What
And
they
so
don't understand is God can take that richness away from them.
that's right. Oh,
And what I was referring to a while ago was when they had the banks failed and, people committed suicide because
Oh,
they
yeah.
lost everything.
oh, yeah.
Yeah, that has happened in our country where the rich have been taken down instantly.
What was,
And their foundation stand.
what was that famous poem about the guy that was rich and he jumped out the window? My English teacher read it when I was
In that time, I think some did.
Yeah. And it happened during, the Great Depression.
Yeah, yeah,
But anyway,
yeah,
he-
everything crashed,
think recently, people who were really rich and well off in LA lost their homes too. Just because they were rich, it didn't protect their house from that fire. No,
And most of them didn't have insurance because they canceled on them.
I know it, yeah. This little paragraph in James 1 is very typical of what Jesus does in his teaching, and James certainly is picking up on it. The Christian worldview is so different from our culture. And we need to drill down in the book of James, and this is one of them. We need to make sure that we see the world the way Jesus wants us to. And because this is the challenge, often we may find ourselves seeing around us. This is interesting. How many people don't do this? If you're trying to act this way, and this is trying to be the attitude and the ethic that you're living by, it doesn't take you long to look around and see, well, I don't see too many other people trying to do this. Yeah, Barbara?
Money in itself, I don't think is wicked. It's, God tells us it's the way we use what we have.
Yeah.
We could be poor and have $2. We need to use that $2 in the best way we can
Well,
stretch it.
people have misquoted the Bible verse that says money is the love, the love of money is the root of all, or let's see, money is the root of all evil. That's not what the verse says. It's the love of money that's the root of all evil. That's different.
Well, James, he's gonna touch on everything that's gonna hit us. I mean, there's something in here for all of us.
Oh, this is power. And you know what this is rooted in? I thought about this early this morning. This is rooted in Jesus' teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, where he says you can't serve two masters at once. You either serve God or you serve materialism. Can't do both. So, well, hopefully this was a good discussion this morning, and we'll pick up at this point next week in James chapter 1.